Okay, so what is the blood-brain barrier? Here's a 3D print of a human brain, and this is in here. Remember, the brain and the spinal cord form the central nervous system, or the CNS. Versus the ganglia, the nerves. Everything sort of that's outside here in the body. That's called the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. And both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system are separated by a system of these kinds of layers. There's like a tough kind of leathery sort of outer kind of coating that's called the Dura Mater, which means the tough mother. And then below that is this actually remarkably beautiful. We've seen actual brain surgeries where you can see these gray, sort of glistening, filamentous, like kind of web-like projections from the dura down to the vasculature. Like your brain is sort of floating in a web of not only these filamentous, what are called the arachnoid layer, but also all this vasculature, all these blood vessels that are being suspended by these like glistening gray arachnoid projections from the dura, and then around the vasculature, and then down to the final sort of layer, this very soft layer, thin layer that surrounds directly over the surface of the brain and spinal cord. That's called the pia mater, which means the soft mother. Collectively, the dura mater, the tough mother, the leathery outer coating, the arachnoid, that web-like, kind of cabling that holds the vasculature, around in this actually fluid-filled space. It's called the subarachnoid space. And then the pia mater, the soft mother, these are collectively called the meninges. And they're a structural, feature, like a sac, basically, that surrounds, the brain and spinal cord and separates the central nervous system from the peripheral nervous system. But there's another kind of separation that's really critically important when we discuss psychopharmacology, and that is actually something called the blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier is basically in the vasculature itself. It's a barrier between, the flow of blood in the vasculature within the brain and spinal cord, and the brain and spinal cord itself. So vasculature, the plumbing of your body, basically is, it's tube-like, right? And these tubes, these various, veins and arteries and capillaries and everything like that are actually bound by cells. Everything is formed of cells, the cell doctrine. And these cells in most of your body, actually, it's interesting. You have, for example, arteries, which are carrying oxygenated blood that has come from the lungs to the heart and then gets pumped out, right? And then they branch into smaller branches that are called arterioles. And then ultimately these branch into the very smallest of branches, which are called capillaries. And those capillaries are where exchange really occurs, between substances that are in the blood and substances that are outside the blood. And in most of your body, the capillaries, those little tubes that are carrying blood and amino acids and glucose and drugs, all sorts of things. Basically, the cells that form those capillaries kind of adhere to each other a little loosely. They're a little leaky. Your capillaries in most of the body actually leak, and that allows for substances to pass more freely, driven by things like concentration gradient force, in and out, basically of the bloodstream and the body, this exchange. However, in the brain and spinal cord, these capillary cells tend to more tightly adhere to each other. They form much tighter junctions. And this is, we know, partly because of the contributions of the glial cells. These are support cells in the central nervous system that actually release, certain chemical factors that help to stimulate more tight adhesion or tight junctions between these capillary cells. But the upshot is that there's more of a barrier between blood and brain in the central nervous system. It's not as easy. It's not as leaky. Your plumbing is not leaky or as leaky in the brain and spinal cord in the central nervous system as it is in the peripheral nervous system. And this has significance for drugs, obviously, because in order to get things from the blood out into the brain, oftentimes you need specialized transport mechanisms. Remember, transporters, which have to utilize ATP to grab the things you really want, like a specific amino acid, for example, and pull it in, to the brain. There's actually at OHSU, Ed Newelt is a physician and a researcher who developed what's called the blood-brain barrier program, where initially they tried to actually disrupt the blood-brain barrier to specifically deliver drugs, often chemotherapy drugs, into the brain. So they'd have to, do something to sort of loosen those junctions and allow for more leaky plumbing in the central nervous system, at least for a limited period of time. And it's been found also that, the impacts, for example, of stress, of like sort of prolonged, traumatic stress can also result in changes in that blood-brain barrier and can make that blood-brain barrier less complete, and allow, perhaps under certain circumstances, chemicals that would not normally have access to the central nervous system to actually get access. Now, I do want to mention that even if a drug only acts on targets in the peripheral nervous system, it doesn't mean it doesn't have central effects, because you've got all that peripheral nervous system, all those sensory receptors that are responding to heart rate and responding to changes in the body, et cetera. So if the drug is acting just peripherally, your central nervous system will hear about it, even if the drug isn't directly acting on targets in the CNS and can't cross the blood-brain barrier. So anyway, yeah.